Hey everybody, I'm Eric Gerlach. This is another talk on Zen philosophy and Dahui, one of the figures of Zen Buddhism we have not talked about yet, who is very important and central for what follows. In fact, he is very much the last of the Chinese folks we're going to talk about. We will talk about other Chinese Chan Zen folks and figures as we go. But we are very much going to, insofar as talk more about Zen, be talking more about Korea and Japan a decent amount. And we're going to get to Musashi and others. So, as we get along to figures in Japan, Dogen, and others, I am not actually the Dogen guy. Many people are. I am not. I'm not him yet. Maybe someday I will be. In the past. But as far as going over Chinese figures of Zen, Dahui is the last guy we're going to cover, and then I actually have several videos I can make about Japanese figures, and I have one about Dogen I will make, and that involves, first and foremost, along the lineages, Dahui, and what becomes the Soto school of Zen in Japan, which is still the Soto school of Zen in Japan. Zen very much survives, is in China as Chan, still. But in Japan, Linji's Rinzai House of Zen becomes and is still a major religion of Japanese culture and a staple. And the Soto school of Zen, both houses of Chan in China, remain the two powerful schools of Zen of Japan, of traditional religion of Japan. Have been for centuries. There is a third school of Buddhism in Japan. I don't cover that much, and much love, again, but I will mention it when it comes time, and we get to Japan. So, while the House of Linji, for the Japanese Rinzai, was the dominant school of Chan in Song China, another competing stream of Zen arose, the silent illumination of the House of Caodong. This is another thing, just to briefly say. Q now is pronounced CH, if you're reading Chinese transliterated into English. Meant much in the pinyin system, which it actually took Americans and other people 30 years until the 80s, after it was invented, to adopt, along with them starting to do more business with China, almost like they didn't want to adopt it while they weren't accepting Chinese communism, and now we largely have, did in the 80s. That's when I was, hello, and onward. Not sure if Dogen was there much. That the house of C in the pinyin is TS, which is weird. So it's I was pronouncing it wrong, and I have before, because these are the mistakes you would easily make pronouncing transliterated Chinese and English. Chi, like energy, used to be spelled CH''I. They got rid of the apostrophe. Unfortunately, they also got rid of the CH, and it's QI as chi. And then this is the Caodong school, as best as I can pronounce it, and I'm not good at it, but the C here is pronounced a TS, and that is weird. It's like sort of in the same part of the mouth, according to the linguists, and the linguistics folks and studies. And that's, again, there is much in the pinyin system that works much better. The first and foremost one always to mention is Taoism is spelled with a D rather than a T now, which is great. There's many spelling changes that work. That is one that is still weird. So this is the House of Caodong, which becomes Soto, like Caodong, Soto is the Chinese to the Japanese. Like Chan becomes Zen in Japanese, and Caodong becomes Soto. And again, see the linguists about all of that. None of them are presently in my apartment in ways I can see. So, unlike the House of Linji, which is Rinzai in Japanese, so Linji Rinzai from Chinese to Japanese, the House of Caodong was nearly dead in the Song dynasty. But in the late Song, the Caodong master, Hongzi, Master Hong, revived it while competing against Dahui of the House of Linji, both students of Yuan Wu, who wrote and compiled the Blue Cliff Record. So we had the Blue Cliff Record. I just made a video about the Gateless Gate. Two students of that guy, of Yuan Wu, became very much both houses. Or at least went on to strengthen and or leave the House of Linji, what the Japanese call Rinzai. The Caodong put emphasis on seated meditation practice rather than koan contemplation, and interviews between masters and students about koan cases. Now, Lin Ji actually spoke of this as he is lecturing, and people are gathering the koans into cases, and then people are back and forth about whether or not they like this new kind of literature, while they like this new kind of practice. Some, and it's the Zen Chan folks who like these. Other schools of Buddhism in China don't know what these guys are doing and would hate that these guys rise above them in the Song. Lin Ji in the Tang Dynasty before the Song as the central, again, formative patriarch, not Bodhidharma, but the central guy that makes Rinzai and Zen a thing, spoke critically of these kind of monks. He said there are a bunch of blind, bald-headed fools who, having stuffed themselves with rice, he says in his sermons, which I already went over in several talks and love, these folks, they stuff themselves with rice and sit doing Chan-style meditation practice, trying to arrest, stop the flow of thoughts and stop them from arising, hating clamor, demanding silence. But these aren't Buddhist ways. Look at the long discourses of the Buddha. This is actually Potapata. He says, shh, guys, Buddha's coming. He likes it quiet. Like, hey, how's it going, Buddha? I hear you like it quiet. Like, it actually much more sounds like Potapata, actually, which is much more like a Taoist. I do say during that talk, it's kind of like Nietzsche or like a Taoist. It's like, oh, you like it quiet. Like, you like order. You like silence. You don't like a lot of things. Why don't I clear off a seat and you can just sit down here in your safe space? Why don't you just sit here where it's nice and comfortable for you, is what he's saying. Which is, of course, a bit of mockery, and I have no idea what else it is. And he's actually saying, no, sitting silent. And, of course, think of the irony of saying, and the almost blatant hypocrisy, thus, and the contradiction of saying sitting and doing meditation and being quiet isn't Buddhist. Who are these people kidding? As mentioned, it is true, and we now know that the Buddha did a lot of seated meditation while he was dying, and then actually it's the reclining Buddha who is the dying Buddha in that station of the cross and or Buddha life, which is, there's 4 of them, that's sort of the 4th station of the Buddha rather than the cross. And he is reclining like in the Thailand and the Street Fighter, and that is him dying. But actually, he sat a lot in seated meditation as he was dying to calm himself in the face of death. And actually, he was most famous and had most followers then towards the end of his life. And Kalupahana, whose work I do enjoy and appreciate, and he says that, well, maybe a lot of Buddhists very quickly thought seated meditation was the thing to do a lot, and maybe that wasn't what the Buddha thought everybody ought to do a lot, because he argued with everybody also and kept going around looking at things and arguing with everyone. So maybe seated meditation is not entirely it, or not. But these guys may not know that, and yet still have very much that opinion, those opinions, from being far better schooled in the back and forths of Buddhist schools than I likely ever will be. Dahui Zonggao, who lived from 1089 to 1163, studied for many years with many masters, becoming a gifted expert in Linji, Rinzai, Chan, Zen, but failing to find enlightenment. His teacher gave him a koan. It's again actually gong'an in the Chinese, koan, case on the bench for the in Japanese. I continue to call it consistently koan. The question: where do all Buddhas come from? And the reply: the East Mountain walks over the water. He was told. Now, we haven't heard that one before. And in fact, in doing my studies, that was the first time I had heard that, and I had not heard that before in any of the stuff I had studied before that. He struggled with it, giving 49 answers, 7 times 7 also, all of which his teacher rejected. Then his teacher gave him to be and not to be. He hands him Hamlet. It's quite ham-handed. To be and not to be, but in the Chinese, like a flowering vine clinging to a tree. So, to be and not to be, like a flowering vine clinging to a tree. Somewhat like the flowering hedge of Yunmen. I don't believe I perhaps covered that quickly. After 6 months of contemplation, Dahui was enlightened. He became famous as a teacher while still with his master, was given honors by the Song imperial court, and his following eclipsed all other Buddhists among educated elites during the latter Song. So in other words, we studied Linji. I mentioned at the time, this is Rinzai and the guy who is centrally forming what is going to be Zen still today. And I mentioned that guy's the central guy in the Tong, who's living right around the same time as Jiao Shu. And then that becomes the big school of the Song. So this is the guy, Dahui, who basically is the carrier of Linji's school into the court of the Song, and a major patriarch who enters thus. It is a little bit like, and it's always easy to remember a bit, there's Augustine and Aquinas are two of the most important Catholic philosophers ever. I was going to make a joke about Italians. I will not, and keep it civil. Again, unlike Italy. Or history, anywhere, throughout all this time. Il Papa, the big potato. That's with Augustine is the bringer of Plato into the Catholic Church and Christianity, and Aquinas is the guy who brings people, after Muslims are dealing with him, a bunch of Aristotle a lot. And you can actually remember that and look at the juncture that Augustine is bringing Christians, and specifically Catholics, around 350, this side of Jesus, of course, afterwards, is bringing them a bunch of Plato and saying, hey, this is a bunch of pagan but cool stuff, and they get into it in spite of the fact it's openly polytheistic and ancient Greek, of course. But then Aquinas, around the year 1100, after Muslims are plenty into Aristotle, reads some of those Muslims and Aristotle, and then says Aquinas is, hey, let's get the Catholic Church into Aristotle like no Jesuit with a PhD has ever heard of, I'm sure. Neither that nor Aquinas. Again, Aquinas continues to be quite popular as a philosopher for priests, believe it or not, and has been for 1,000 years. Again, what do we know of scholarship? So Dahui is the guy who makes Zen a thing in the Song court of China, which makes it a thing very much in China and Japan today, and that was done by Linji, and then it becomes Dahui cementing it in the Song. Dahui created the practice of koan introspection, focusing on a single critical phrase, the turning word, if you can say a turning word, as some of these things say, of each encounter dialogue, such as Jiao Shu's nothing, Wu or Mu, or Mazu's no mind, no Buddha, and just focusing on that a whole lot. Now, what you see here is, as mentioned, these are all stories which originally had larger context, and you can actually see a process in Zen where they're cooking it down and cooking it down and cooking it down, and then what is the sound of one hand clapping with like no answer anywhere? And people are like, wow, that's enlightening. And it is, and it's meant to be that way. It also is, it also works in, I'm not trying to say that is wrong, it actually, even the Koreans even take it even more in those ways. But in Son, which is Korean Zen, Chinese Chan originally. But all of these things are kind of experiencing a process of reduction, which they would know of because they're the ones who have these texts. I'm reading over the text in English, They've had them for a lot longer than I have. Had them the whole time even. They've been. So, in that case, cooking everything down to, okay, nothingness, and just focusing, and also seated meditation, and focusing just on that, is and isn't criticized within the Zen school and amongst Buddhist schools, as we've already seen, and as you can see quite here. Dahui says, focusing on mu or wu in the Chinese, mu in the Japanese, like not or empty, not that, kind of, instead of no or yes, does a dog have Buddha nature? Just focusing on that as the response, which of course you're not, he doesn't, and then you never think of anything and that has no context and no meaning in it. He doesn't say that, but of course he is having you strip that down very much. But you may still have insights into it, knowing what situation it has, and these guys know already and have heard the whole stories many ways, we can assume, although they may throw you in there without telling you everything easily in all kinds of ways also. That this nothing or not that or not, nah, nope, not that, is a knife that the individual must use for themselves to cut off their old life of doubt and duality, birth and death. I already mentioned in the last talk, if you are the barrier in the middle, here's birth, here's death, and here's the middle, and continuing, cut off, birth and death, and it is continuous, and again, kind of in a sense, eternal and timeless. By focusing on a single phrase of a single koan as if one's head is on fire, which could be very well a particular punishment of a kind of Buddhist hell. They also speak of trying to swallow a ball of hot iron, which is another specific punishment of a Dante-like hell. And again, Dante may be getting it from the Chinese and Marco Polo or not. Dahui believed that all people, commoners, monks, and masters alike, could gain great freedom and insight, and it has nothing to do with intelligence or education. That's very Protestant. You see that a lot in religion. What was for the elites, and again, I have been mentioning that in a lot of different lectures, won't sum it up all right here. What was for the elites soon enough becomes for enough common people and popularizes. And you can see appeals to that and strategies of that in the cultures of religion and philosophy and science and thought. And so in there, no, it's don't worry about, having a degree. Don't worry you're smarter than me or not. Like, all you have to do here is just concentrate on one or two of these, and no, it can help people, which is a nice thought. Could be used for better or worse after that, but is a very nice, thought to popularize these and say, I'm stripping them down and I'm making them simple for people. Not because I'm trying to cut out all the context, but because I'm trying to get something to somebody, and help them out a bit. We'll get to where Japanese Buddhism is strangely Protestant in ways kind of like this sometimes, especially with the Pure Land schools and other things. It becomes like, no, we're just trying to strip it down to help everybody. We got to be brutal with it. And it's an interesting sort of human condition and response that we can find all over the place in history. So we must doubt words, no matter how smart or how foolish we are, Dahui says, and refuse to be fooled. Once again, words are something doubtable. There's something central to the human mind that are words and logic, and there's something where more skeptical thought wants you to doubt the power of words in ways. But do they want you to trust them or not? Remember, Mazu likes to call people's names out, and then when he jerks you around like pulling your nose physically, he's like, what? I didn't say anything. You want something? Dahui only used a few koans for each student, teaching that one or two cases could be all an individual needs, which is why he found collections of dozens of cases misleading. Now, this actually is definitely not what I do. I'll just point out and keep going. I like showing people tons and tons of stuff and saying, look at all the similarities and differences. Dahui is very much saying you should sit and concentrate on one or two things and not get all mixed up with a bunch of things. Now, if everything's in everything, you could certainly find everything in one or two cases. That's legit. Of course, in talking, rather manically and covering a lot of this stuff, I cover tons and tons of cases. I'm like, look at the forest between the trees. Yeah. So this is a bit of a different strategy. But then again, I get a bit claustrophobic at times. So according to traditional sources, especially this year, Dahui was so worried that koan study was becoming a literary tradition rather than a lived practice that he burned the original wood blocks used to print the Blue Cliff Record. And he destroyed as many copies of his master's text as he could, which is why this central koan collection was eclipsed in popularity by the Gateless Gate. The Gateless Gate, though, of course, also again mentioned shorter, easier to print. And some part of me also wants to think that, if you claim to destroy a thing, that may make it more valuable. But of course, actually, it does seem like he thought that you really should go into a monastery, which has its things back and forth with Mahayana Buddhism. Hey, buddy. I have somebody tapping on my leg. Who wants to say hello? Hey, buddy. Sorry, buddy. I can't play right now. He's been playing with the fuzzy things, and he needs more fuzziness. Yes. Again, cats shorten down the koan cases to non-existent because they do not need them. Do you need the original Blue Cliff Record? Do you need woodblock printing for 1,000 years for any intelligence at all? Cat does not. Do you? It's a bit of a dog whistle, kind of sound. Put down the cat and the joke. Again, now we have freedom for other things. So, what you can see, of course, here, is that, he is the guy who's tried to destroy the Blue Cliff record. It survived. I have to say thankfully because I like it a lot. But when I was in college, I actually paid $60 for an inferior version of the Blue Cliff record from Shambhala Publishing, and I looked at it and I was like, it's kind of, crabby, but okay. That was back when I really couldn't afford $60. And then like 2 years later, 3 years later, they come out with a much better copy. I bought that for like $50. And yes, I did, because actually that was the first time I could find the Blue Cliff record in English by Shambhala Publishing. And that was actually, the internet was kicking plenty, but that was, Anywho's, like, actually this stuff getting into English much at all such that it could be popular, I have to say. Not only did they just decide to try to sort of destroy the text back in the day, this is only in English very recently. And it's, it's not that many hands and feet, you know what I mean, away from just beginning to kind of exist in English. So Dahui rejected Chan without koan practices, such as Hongse's silent illumination, which he argued left delusion, much as it is in the individual mind. But he also rejected excessive koan practices, so a balance, he's doing more or less than others, from the house of Linji. So he is bringing it to the court, but he also finds other outer houses of, derivative houses of Linji like Chan. I have clawing on my foot, reminding me there are still competing houses of Chan. Yeah. What's up, buddy? I can't play right now. The robbers in the countryside again must be soundly amused, and then soundly put to sleep later. I will see. Yes. Yes. Well, patience is a virtue, and cats are a pleasure. So, let's see here. The Dahui is not into just doing koan practices a lot. For Dahui, that he attacked Hongse's practice of silent illumination as heretical in his sermons. But he also officiated at Hongse's funeral. So funny enough, he wrote polemics against him, but then they were also friends, and he actually was official enough that he had to officiate. Showing the two were opposed in their teachings, but not bitter enemies. For Dahui, practicing Buddhism without koans is like a blind man without a walking stick, who can't take a single step forward. We will have Hakuin and Japanese Buddhism and Zen later, with the blind man and the blind men and the bridge. It is from him and the Japanese Rinzai school that we get the tradition of contemplating, by his influence on Hakuin and others, as mentioned, that we get the single sound of one hand clapping or the sound of a tree falling in the forest, and you imagine the Zen monk focusing on that one clipped out phrase of those two latter, I believe possibly Japanese koans. I have, as of yet, I study this stuff as best I can. I know that the tree falling in the forest and the sound of one hand clapping are Hakuin, and he's famous for those in Japan. I am not aware of those having much of a precedent in China as they are right like that. I think. I could always be proven a fool and shown that Hakuin actually found those in earlier Chinese texts. If anybody wants to correct me, please do, because then I will correct myself with your continued help. So it's my understanding that actually it is our perception, my American and many of your perception, that a Japanese Zen monk focusing on the sound of one hand clapping or the tree falling in the forest and not making a sound, and just doing that for a year or 2 or 10, and if that's your image of Zen, that is very much Dahui cementing Zen as Linji's Rinzai Zen Chan in China, and then this guy having a profound influence on Japanese Buddhism, Zen, and Hakuin, who's a very famous figure and is the guy who painted the blind men on the log bridge several times. So 1, 2, and 3, I think. At least 2 and 3. The Epicureans of ancient Greece and Rome would write, "Death is nothing to us" on their tombstones, figuring they weren't around to see it. Dahui's verse before death reads, "Birth is thus, death is thus. Verse or no verse, what's the fuss?" I do take the right to slightly transliterate these such that they're simplified or rhyme a tiny bit. That is a faithful translation, though. It's not my translation. It is my slight paraphrase. But again, it comes off wonderfully well. So yes, that is Dahui. Here I will tack on just at the end, not as a separate video, but also Hongse, because we just mentioned Hongse, Master Hong, here from 1091 to 1157. He was the guy, again, was attacked, and yet had his funeral, died earlier, officiated by Dahui. He was 2 years younger than Dahui, created silent illumination chants, Soto, which is the other school in Japan, other than the Rinzai, which is Hakuin. He was more into seated meditation rather than koan practice to produce peaceful awareness, telling his students to sit like a withered tree stump, which is also a metaphor that comes from China and then is popular in Japan. Hongse traveled widely, but ended up on Mount Tiantong, where Dogen, from Japan, who's very big in Japanese Zen, who is the big Soto guy, studied while in China. Hongse said that enlightenment is, quote, "a bright, flawless pearl, and inscribing words on it deprives it of value," meaning actually even these short and tricky words of koan practice, like sort of burning the records, they're not as good as staring at stuff in a certain sense. You can just stare at anything and see these things. I don't want it to be fixed texts like this. So pardon my practices. He was successful, though not as much as Dahui, with Song elites and intellectuals in China before both of these schools become the two major schools in Japan. Hongse wrote that many works which became central to the revival of the House of Caodong, called Soto, again Caodong Soto, in Japan, the main rival of the House of Linji, Rinzai, emphasizing meditative awareness of stream of thoughts, allowing them to rise and pass away without interfering with them. I think it's Jack Cornfield, he's an American Buddhist instructor, teacher, guru, says, gazing at the waterfall, and it picked that up from East Asian Buddhism, as you try to calm and be aware of things. The flow of things and all the stuff doesn't stop, so it is gazing at the waterfall and acceptance of everything, not just perfect silence and emptiness, but the openness of everything. All right, that said, that is Dahui. Thank you for all of that. And Hongse, of course, thrown in extra bonus. Of course, if all is one, that's nothing at all. And much happiness, enlightenment, to you and yours and everybody around you who needs it. And again, I will see you if I ever see you.